After my grandfather passed, I learned that he left the 90% of inheritance to a stranger. When I asked questions, my mother made me swear not to pursue the matter anymore. I woke up to my father's voice coming through the wall. Not words, just the specific quality of it. My father is not a loud man. He measures things before he says them. He has a way of occupying rooms quietly that I grew up reading as steadiness, as the particular calm of someone who has decided not to waste energy on things that don't require it. What came through the wall that morning was not that voice. I lay in the guest bed of my grandparents' house in California, my grandfather's house now, the house of someone who was no longer in it, and I listened to the tone of something I had never heard from my father before, and I understood before I was fully awake that something had shifted in the night. My grandfather had been buried the previous afternoon. The will had been read that morning. I got up. Let me tell you what I knew about my family's history before that morning. Not much. I'm 20. I grew up in Vancouver where my parents built a life I understood simply as our life. My father in finance, my mother warm and funny, and consistently the person who made wherever we were feel like home. My grandparents were the vague, warm presence that grandparents are when they live in another country and you see them a few times a year. Holiday visits. The specific smell of my grandfather's house. My grandmother's cooking, which she had shown my mother some of and not all of, a fact my mother mentioned occasionally with fond frustration. My grandmother died when I was young enough that I have impressions rather than memories of her. My grandfather I knew better, a quiet man with specific opinions about specific things and a way of sitting in a room that suggested he had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He called on my birthday every year without fail. Short calls, warm, always ending the same way, stay curious, like it was both a goodbye and an instruction. He died in September. We flew down for the funeral. My parents had mentioned the estate in the careful way of people managing their own anxiety about a thing while trying not to transmit it. I was counting on some portion of whatever was left, not dramatically, not expecting a windfall, but my architecture program had a gap between what the partial scholarship covered and what it cost, and my grandfather's estate had been mentioned in family conversations as a possible bridge. The will reading was at 9 in the morning. By 9:45, I understood there would be no bridge. 97%. The lawyer, Hartwell, older, with the professional composure of someone who has delivered uncomfortable information many times and developed a working relationship with the discomfort, read the numbers in the measured tone of a man doing his job. 97% of the estate left to a single individual, a name I was hearing for the first time. A man who had not attended the funeral, a man whose relationship to our family I could not place in any context I had been given. 3% divided between my father and a scattering of distant relatives. My father sat very still through the reading, my mother beside him equally still. I sat between them and watched both their faces and found nothing I could read clearly. In the car afterward, no one said anything. That was the night. The voice through the wall was the morning. I stood in the hallway outside my parents' room. My father was not shouting. Shouting would have been easier to understand. Shouting has a clear shape, a clear cause and effect. What he was doing was something more controlled and therefore more alarming, speaking at a sustained low intensity that carried through walls in a way normal speech doesn't. I couldn't make out words, just the cadence, something long and held returning finally to the surface. My mother's voice came between his in the shorter intervals of someone listening more than speaking. I went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table I had sat at on every visit to this house since I was old enough to remember visiting. My grandfather's table. 97% to a man whose name I'd heard for the first time yesterday. Stay curious. My father came downstairs an hour later. He had reorganized his face into something closer to the version I knew, controlled, measured, the specific containment of someone who has decided the exterior should not reflect the interior. He poured coffee. He sat across from me. I said, "Who is he?" My father looked at his cup. He said, "Old family matter." I said, "His name wasn't in anything you ever mentioned. I don't have any memory of it." He said, "There's no reason you would." I said, 97% is a reason." My father turned his cup slowly on the table, once, twice. He said, "Some things are better left where they are." He said it without anger, quietly. The way you say something when you mean it, and also when you know the person you're saying it to is not going to accept it. I said, "Hartwell said something. When I asked him about the split, he said I should ask you. He said something about what was done to him." My father looked up then. Something moved across his face that I filed away without fully understanding. He said, "I'm asking you to leave this alone." He took his coffee and went back upstairs. My mother found me in the garden an hour later. The garden had been my grandfather's project, specific plants, in positions that I had never understood the logic of, but that apparently had one. My grandfather had tended it with the particular patience of someone doing something they had chosen to do rather than felt obligated to. She sat beside me on the bench that faced the back fence. She said, "I know you have questions." I said, "Yes." She said, "I need you to understand that some things have histories that are very old and very complicated, and that opening them doesn't produce clean answers." I said, "I'm not looking for clean answers. I'm looking for any answers." She said, "I know. I'm asking you, asking, not telling, to let this one go, for now." I looked at the garden. I said, "Hartwell said what was done to him. What does that mean?" My mother was quiet for a long moment. She said, "It means your grandfather spent the last years of his life trying to make right something that couldn't be made right. This was the only tool he had left." She said, "That's all I can tell you." She went back inside. I found Hartwell at the small reception the neighbors had organized that afternoon. He was near the food table with the presence of someone whose attendance was expected. I waited until he was standing alone. I said, "I need to ask you something." He looked at me with composed attention, like someone who had expected this. I said, "My parents won't tell me about the split, about who he is or what was done to him. I'm asking you directly." He said, "I can't discuss the estate or the family's private matters. You understand that?" I said, "I'm not asking about the estate. I'm asking why a man who apparently hasn't spoken to this family in years received nearly everything." Hartwell looked at me for a moment. He said, "Your grandfather was a man who understood late what he should have understood earlier. The will was his attempt to account for that." He said, "I'd suggest that the fact your parents don't want to discuss this is itself information, and that the direction of that information isn't toward you." He picked up a small plate of food. He said, "I'm sorry about your grandfather. He was a good man who made choices he spent a long time regretting. Stay curious. Those were his words about you. He said it every time I saw him." He moved away into the room. I stood by the food table for a long time. We flew back to Vancouver the following morning. My father spent the flight with headphones in and eyes closed in the way of someone who is not sleeping. My mother read something on her phone that I don't think she was actually reading. I sat between them and looked at the clouds below and thought about a name I'd heard for the first time 2 days ago. An old man who had left nearly everything to a person his family refused to speak about. A lawyer who had told me that my grandfather spent his last years trying to make right something that couldn't be made right. I thought about the gap in my funding that was now a gap without a bridge. I thought about stay curious. I didn't say anything on the flight. But I was 20 years old and I had been given three things: a name, a lawyer's careful phrase, and the specific awareness that there was a door in my family's history that everyone except me already knew was there. Back in Vancouver, the days resumed their ordinary shape. The architectural firm where I worked part-time needed me on a site visit the following week. A residential development in the east end of the city, the kind of project that involved long days of measuring and recording and carrying things, and asking questions of people who knew more than me about the practical realities of what I was trying to learn theoretically. I liked this work in the specific way of someone doing the entry-level version of something they actually want to do with their life. My best friend Jean asked me about the trip over the phone the evening I got back. Jean has known me since we were 15. He has the specific quality of someone who notices when something is off with you before you've said anything about it, and who waits for you to say it rather than pressing. He's patient in a way that doesn't feel like patience, it just feels like him. I told him about the inheritance, the split, Hartwell's phrase, my parents shut down. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That's not a normal inheritance split." I said no. He said, 97% to someone the family won't explain. That's a statement. I said, that's what I keep thinking. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know yet. My parents are pretty clear that they want me to leave it alone. He said, are you going to? I said, probably not. He said, okay, let me know what you find. That was Jean, no pressure. No advice I hadn't asked for, just let me know. I spent the following 2 weeks doing what I could from a distance, which it turned out was not much. The name from the will produced nothing useful in any search I ran. No social media presence. No professional listings I could connect to my family. No digital footprint that a 20-year-old with a laptop and a free evening could find. My father had no social media either. He had always said he didn't see the point, which I had always accepted as a personality trait, and which I now considered from a slightly different angle. The extended family was sparse. My father had never been close to his relatives in any meaningful sense. I had grown up knowing a handful of cousins I saw at major gatherings and almost nobody else. None of them were people I had real relationships with. None of them were people I could call and ask questions of without the call getting back to my father immediately. The investigation, such as it was, stalled before it properly started. Life continued. Site visits, evening research that produced nothing, phone calls with Jean where I updated him on the absence of updates. Then the field visit. It was a Tuesday in late autumn. Long day. The kind that ends with everyone going for drinks I usually skipped because I was saving money. I'd stayed behind to finish some measurements when a man approached me outside the site as I was packing up. He introduced himself as a family friend. Said he'd recognized me from the funeral. Said he'd known my family years ago and hadn't had the chance to say hello at the service. I want to describe how I read him in that first moment, because the gap between how I read him then and how I understand him now is something I've spent a significant amount of time with. He was warm, patient, the specific unhurried quality of someone with a lot of time who was genuinely interested in the person in front of them. He asked about my work, not as a conversation filler but in the way of someone who wanted to actually know. He mentioned my grandfather warmly, specific memories, the kind that are only available to someone who had actually known the person. He said his name was Marcus. I said I didn't think I'd heard of him. He smiled and said families don't always share everything. We talked for 20 minutes standing outside the site in the cold. He mentioned he was in the city for work for a few months. He suggested coffee sometime, casually, the way people suggest things they may or may not follow up on. I said sure. I drove home and called Jean. I said a man approached me at the site today, says he's a family friend, knew my grandfather. Jean said, "A family friend you've never heard of." I said he knew specific things, real things about my grandfather. Jean said, I said, "What?" He said, "I'm not saying he's not what he says. Just keep your eyes open." I said I would. I thought I would. The first coffee was 2 weeks later. He was easier to talk to than almost anyone I'd met recently. The specific quality of someone who retains everything from the previous conversation and builds on it, who makes you feel like the last time you spoke was recent even when it wasn't. He mentioned my grandfather again. Another specific memory, a particular habit my grandfather had, a thing he always said in certain situations. I hadn't known this thing. When I mentioned it to my mother later in a phone call, she laughed and said yes, that was exactly him, and I felt the specific warmth of learning something true about someone you can no longer ask directly. Marcus said, "Your grandfather was a man who carried things for a long time without putting them down. Some people are like that. They hold things because they don't know how to hand them over, and then they run out of time." I said, "What kind of things did he carry?" He looked at his coffee, a pause that had the quality of a decision being made. He said, "Old things. The kind that accumulate when families make choices that serve some people and cost others." He said it quietly, not dramatically, like an observation rather than an implication. He changed the subject. I drove home and sat with it. The second coffee was 3 weeks later. I had told my girlfriend Dina about Marcus by this point. Dina was a year ahead of me at the firm, steadier than me in most ways, the person I went to when I needed to think something through rather than just feel it. She'd listened to the whole account, the inheritance, Hartwell's phrase, my parents' shutdown, the man who'd approached me at the site. Her response had been measured. She said, "What does he actually want from these coffees?" I said, "I think he's just being friendly." She said, "People are usually friendly for a reason." I said, "You sound like Jean." She said, "Jean sounds right." I wasn't defensive. I just didn't have anything concrete enough to anchor the unease to yet. At the second coffee, Marcus mentioned my father. Not directly. He said, "Your father always struck me as someone who built things very carefully and then lived inside them very carefully. There's a kind of person who constructs their life like architecture, everything load-bearing, nothing accidental." I said, "How well did you know him?" He said, "Well enough to recognize the type." He said it pleasantly, with the smile of someone who has said exactly what they meant to say. When I got home, I stood in my kitchen for a while before I could think clearly enough to make dinner. The third coffee. Somewhere between the second and third, I had started paying attention to things I hadn't thought to pay attention to before. Like the fact that Marcus had never signed into the site visitor log. I realized this gradually, not in a flash, more like something surfacing over several days. The site required all visitors to sign in. I had never seen Marcus sign in. I hadn't thought about it because I hadn't thought about it. I checked the logs. His name, the name he had given me, did not appear on any date in the records I had access to. I went to the site manager, asked casually about visitor logs from the Tuesday he'd first approached me. She confirmed. Everyone signed in, no exceptions, and she didn't recognize the name. I asked if anyone had inquired about the field visit schedule in advance. She thought about it. She said there was a call maybe 2 months ago, someone asking which days the junior staff would be on site, said they were coordinating something. I gave them the dates. She said, "I assumed it was internal." I said, "Do you remember anything about the voice?" She said, "Older man, polite, very specific about the dates." I thanked her and left. He had called ahead, found out when I'd be on site, positioned himself to be there. The encounter that had felt like coincidence had been arranged. I sat in my car outside the site and called Jean. I told him about the visitor log, the advance call, the dates. He was quiet for longer than usual. He said he targeted you specifically. I said yes. He said he knew who you were at the funeral and he made a plan. I said yes. Jean said, do you have any photographs of the man from your grandparents' house? Old family photos. I said probably, at my parents' place. He said you should look. I said I know. He said, do you want me to come with you? I said not yet, let me think about it. I drove home. I want to be honest about why I didn't go to look at the photographs immediately. It wasn't caution. It was something closer to fear. The specific fear of finding out something that changes the shape of what you're standing on. I was 20 years old and the ground already felt less stable than it had 3 months ago, and I wasn't sure I was ready to find out how much less stable it could get. So I waited. In the meantime, I went to the third coffee. I went in differently than the previous two. Not showing my hand, I didn't have a hand to show yet, just a suspicion and an absence in a visitor log, and a phone call the site manager couldn't fully describe. I went in and listened for construction rather than content, for what he was leading me toward without appearing to lead. He told a story. He framed it as something he'd heard, a situation he knew of, something that had happened in a family he'd been adjacent to years ago. A brother who fell in love with his sibling's girlfriend, parents who knew and covered it up, the girlfriend disappearing overnight, years of deception maintained through coordinated effort, secret visits, manufactured excuses, a family that had reorganized itself around a lie. He told it carefully, with the specific measured quality of someone who has rehearsed how to deliver information without appearing to deliver it. When he finished, he said, tragic thing. The people inside it justified it to themselves as protecting everyone. But protection that requires that level of architecture isn't protection. It's self-preservation dressed as kindness. He looked at his coffee. I said, why are you telling me this? He said, I thought you'd find it interesting, given your family's situation. Then he changed the subject. I drove home from the third coffee with my hands slightly unsteady on the wheel. I sat in my apartment for 3 hours. The story he'd told had the specific quality of something that was both hypothetical and not. The details were too particular, the emotional texture too real. The way he'd looked at his coffee when he said protection isn't protection was too deliberate. I thought about the inheritance split, the name no one would explain. Hartwell saying your grandfather spent his last years trying to make right something that couldn't be made right. I thought about the story Marcus had told me. I thought about a brother who fell in love with his sibling's girlfriend. I didn't say anything to my parents. I wasn't ready. I didn't have anything concrete, and I knew from the funeral that arriving without concrete things produced only shutdown. I sat with it for 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks had their own weight. I went to work. I came home. I ate meals I don't remember eating. I called Gene every few days and updated him on what I was sitting with. He listened and didn't push, and occasionally said the one useful thing that clarified whatever was getting murky. I told Dina about the third coffee. She listened to the whole account, the story Marcus had told, the framing of it, the way he'd looked at his coffee. She said, he's telling you something about your family. I said, I think so. She said, directly or indirectly? I said, indirectly. Everything is indirect with him. She said, why indirectly? I said, I don't know. She sat with that. She said, maybe because if he said it directly you'd have something concrete to go to your parents with. Indirect keeps it in your head, makes you work for it. I looked at her. She said, I'm not saying don't pursue it. I'm saying be aware that someone who wants to control information delivers it indirectly. You're being managed towards something and you don't know yet what it is. I said, I know. She said, be careful. In the second of the 2 weeks, I went to my parents' house on a Saturday when my father was at a work event, and my mother was out visiting a friend. I want to be honest about this. I went into my parents' storage without permission looking for something I had not been invited to look for. I'm not going to justify it beyond this. I had tried the direct approach at the funeral and been shut down by everyone who had relevant information. The indirect approach, which was waiting for my parents to volunteer something, had produced nothing in 3 months. I was out of options that didn't involve doing something I wouldn't have done 6 months ago. The storage room was organized the way my father organized everything, methodically, labeled, nothing in the wrong place. I went through 3 boxes before I found the one with old photographs. Printed photographs from before digital cameras were standard. My grandparents younger than I had known them. My father as a young man. The specific look of someone before their face settles into its adult version. In several photographs beside my father was another young man. I looked at the face for a long time. I took photographs of the photographs on my phone and left the box exactly as I'd found it. I sent the photographs to Gene without explanation. He called 20 minutes later. He said, "Who is this?" I said, "That's what I'm trying to figure out." He said, "Where did you find these?" I said, "My parents' storage." He was quiet. He said, "How old is this photograph?" I said, 20s era probably, maybe early 30s. He said, "And you're comparing this to the man you've been having coffee with?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Give me a day." Gene called back the following evening. He had found through a combination of the university alumni records I'd thought to look at, and several other publicly accessible sources I hadn't, a handful of other photographs from the same era. Different angles, different contexts. He said the structural similarity is consistent. The nose, the way the eyes sit, the jaw angle. He said I'd want more certainty, but it's possible. I said, "If it's him, then the man I've been having coffee with is my uncle." Gene said, "The man from the will." I said, "Yes." We were both quiet for a moment. He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to go to one more coffee." Gene said, "With what you know now?" I said, "With what I know now." He said, "Okay, be careful what you show him." The 4th coffee, I went in watching for different things. Not content, construction, the architecture of what he was building and how. He was exactly as he always was, warm, unhurried, the specific quality of complete attention that I had originally read as generosity and was now reading as something else. He remembered a detail from the previous conversation I hadn't expected him to remember. He built on it. He was good at this. Very good. About 40 minutes in, he mentioned my father. He said, "Your father is a successful man, competent, committed to his family, but there are things that happened in his past and during your life that the people closest to him have been shielded from." I said, "What kind of things?" He said, "I can't be specific. I don't have specifics, but I'd suggest that the version of your father you know and the version that exists in other contexts aren't always the same person." He said it gently, like concern rather than implication. I said, "You're being vague." He said, "I know. I'm sorry. I just think you deserve to know that things aren't always what they appear." We finished the coffee. He suggested we meet again. I said I'd be in touch. I left. I didn't call anyone that evening. I sat in my apartment and went through what I had. A name from a will that produced no digital footprint. A visitor log with an absence where his name should be. An advance call to the site manager about field visit dates. A story about a brother who fell in love with his sibling's girlfriend, told as though it were about someone else. A face in an old photograph that looked like the face of the man across the table. And now, your father isn't always who he appears to be. I went to bed. I didn't sleep well. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, I did two things. The first was that Jean and I went methodically through everything we could find to either confirm or rule out the photograph comparison. University alumni pages, an old industry directory that had scanned records going back decades, a community newsletter from my grandparents' neighborhood that had photographs from events over the years. By the end of 3 weeks, we had 7 comparison data points. Jean said it's him. Not certainly, but the probability had moved to a place where assuming otherwise felt like choosing not to know. The second thing I did was notice that I hadn't heard from Marcus. He had suggested another meeting at the end of the 4th coffee. He had not contacted me. I had his number, the one he'd given me. I sent a message asking if he wanted to reschedule. No response. I tried the number 3 days later. Disconnected. I went back to the site. Not for a scheduled visit. I went on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week he had first approached me, and I walked the site and asked around in the casual way of someone not trying to appear like they're asking around. Nobody had seen him recently. One person thought he had finished up his work and moved on to something else. I went to the site manager. She said, "The person you're describing, I don't think I've seen him in a few weeks, and honestly I'm not sure I ever saw him here officially. He wasn't on any of our contractor or visitor lists." I sat in my car in the site car park. The man who had arranged to meet me by calling ahead for my schedule, who had given me a name that didn't exist in any professional directory, who had been feeding me a specific story in specific installments over several months, had disappeared, with the same deliberate intention with which he had appeared. I sat there for a long time. Then I called Jean. I said, "He's gone." Jean said, "Gone how?" I said, "Number disconnected. Nobody's seen him at the site. No trace." Jean was quiet. He said, "He got what he came for." I said, "I don't know what he came for yet." Jean said, "He planted something about your father, and now he's gone and you're sitting with it." I said, "Yes." He said, "What are you going to do?" I went to Dina. Not that evening. I needed a day to arrange what I was going to say, which is to say, I needed a day to admit to myself what I was actually dealing with before I said it to someone I cared about. I went the following evening and I told her everything, the full sequence from the beginning, the site manager and the advance call, the photographs, the comparison Jean and I had done, the 4 coffees and what had accumulated across them, the disconnected number, the absence at the site. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for longer than usual. She said, "Okay, I need to say something and I need you to hear it without immediately defending." I said, "Okay." She said, "You've been running a parallel investigation for months. You've been receiving information from a person who almost certainly isn't who he said he was. You've been sitting with implications about your father that you don't have evidence for. And now this person is gone and you're left with, what exactly?" I said, "Questions." She said, "Yes, and I need to ask you something directly. Are you going to go to your parents with these questions?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Because if you go to them with this and you're wrong, if the implications about your father are not what they seem, if this man is something other than what you think, you cannot take it back. You understand that?" I said, "I understand that." She said, "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm asking you to slow down before you do anything." She said, "And I need you to know that I'm watching you and you are not okay. You haven't been okay for a while. And I need you to also be taking care of yourself while you figure this out." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm still here. I just needed to say that." What I did not do was act immediately. I want to be clear about this because the version of this story where a 20-year-old receives a sequence of implications from a man who has just vanished and immediately goes home and blows up his family is not the version that actually happened. What actually happened was, I went to therapy for the first time. I had been thinking about it for a while, and this tipped the scale into actually going. My therapist was the first person I told the entire story to from beginning to end, in sequence, and the experience of telling it to someone with no stake in any of it was the first time I understood the actual weight of what I was carrying. She said, "You've been building a picture from pieces that someone else was placing, and now the person placing them has gone. What you have is an incomplete picture and a set of questions. The question is, what are you going to do with an incomplete picture?" I said, "I want to complete it." She said, "How?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "The thing about incomplete pictures is that sometimes completing them changes what you thought you were looking at from the beginning." She said, "Are you prepared for that possibility?" I told her I thought I was. 8 months passed. I want to account for them honestly rather than skip over them, because the skipping would misrepresent what they cost. Dina and I ended in the 4th month. Not dramatically, with the specific exhausted sadness of two people who have reached the limit of what a relationship can hold when one person is carrying something too large and too unresolved. She said she loved me, and that she couldn't continue to be the support structure for something that had no end point she could see. She was right, I knew it when she said it. Gene stayed. That's the thing about Gene, he doesn't have a threshold beyond which he decides you're too much. He brought food sometimes. He sat with me on evenings when sitting with me was all that was available to do. I kept working. I kept going to therapy. I kept the investigation in a corner of my attention without letting it consume everything. In the 8th month, my therapist suggested I go through some of my father's belongings that had been left at my parents' place when he'd taken a position abroad. She said holding on to objects was keeping something open that needed at least the possibility of beginning to close. I went on a Saturday afternoon. The photograph was in the 3rd box. Old, printed on the paper of a different era. A family photograph, my grandparents younger than I'd known them, 2 young men beside them. One of the young men was my father. I recognized him the way you recognize a parent in old photographs, not immediately, then all at once. The other young man I looked at for a long time. I took out my phone. I pulled up the comparison photographs Gene and I had assembled over 3 weeks 8 months ago. I held the phone beside the box photograph. The same nose, the same way the eyes sat, the same specific set of the jaw. Marcus was in this photograph. Marcus was standing beside my father. Marcus was my uncle. I sat on the floor of the storage room. I went through it in sequence. The approach at the site arranged in advance, the call to the site manager, the specific dates he'd asked for, the coffees and the careful feeding of partial information, the story at the 3rd coffee that was not hypothetical, the implications about my father at the 4th, the disconnected number, the disappearance. All of it planned, all of it deliberate. He had found out when I'd be on site. He had positioned himself as a family friend. He had fed me a story about his own life framed as someone else's story to watch me absorb it. He had planted implications about my father and then left before I could do anything with them that he hadn't intended. I was a 20-year-old with a question about his family's history, and he had found that question and used it. I called Gene from the storage room floor. He picked up immediately. I told him about the photograph. He was quiet for a moment. Then, so it was him the whole time. I said, "Yes." He said, "And the story at the 3rd coffee." I said about his own life, his own brother. Gene said, "Your father." I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay, what do you want to do?" I said, "I need to talk to my mother, and I need to set up a call with my father." Gene said, "Do you want me there?" I said, "Yes." My mother went pale. I mean that literally. I watched the color leave her face across the kitchen table as I talked. I showed her the photographs, the old one from the box, the comparison images Jean and I had built. I walked her through the sequence of coffees, the story, the implications, the disappearance. She sat with her hands in her lap for a long time after I finished. She said, "He came here to find you." I said, "Yes." She said, "He planned it." I said, "Yes, for months at minimum, probably longer. He needed to know my schedule before he approached me. He needed to have the story ready in the right order." She said very quietly, "The story he told you, about the brother and the girlfriend." I said, "Yes." She looked at the table. She said, "He did to you what we did to him." She said it quietly, not as an accusation of herself, as an accounting, the specific voice of someone looking at the full shape of a thing for the first time. I said, "Mum." She said, "We deserve it. That doesn't make it right, but we deserve it." I looked at her. She said, "I'll tell you whatever you want to know. I should have told you years ago. I think I knew at some point that it would find its way to you somehow. Things like this do." She said, "Ask me what you want to ask." She told me everything. I'm not going to reproduce the full account here because it involves people who are living, and because some of it is hers to carry in the way she has chosen to carry it. What I'll tell you is the shape of it. My father had a brother. They were close growing up in the way that brothers close in age can be close, genuinely, not performatively, the kind of closeness built from shared experience rather than obligation. My father fell in love with his brother's girlfriend. Not quickly, not without trying to stop it, but he fell and he told the girlfriend and she felt the same, and they made a decision that destroyed something. The girlfriend left without telling her boyfriend why. She just left. She left in the worst time possible. My father's parents, my grandparents, knew. They helped manage it. They helped keep the secret. They warned family members and friends and anyone who might say the wrong thing to the wrong person. My uncle spent years not knowing. When he found out, my mother wasn't clear on exactly how or when. The family was already consolidated around the secret too long to easily unravel. By then my parents were married. By then there was a life built. By then my grandparents had been living with the guilt of it for years. My grandfather changed his will in the last years of his life. My mother said he had tried to reach my uncle, but by then my uncle wasn't taking contact from anyone in the family. The will was the only communication left available to him. "Stay curious," he used to say. He had been trying to pay a debt he couldn't pay any other way. I set up the video call 2 days later. My mother on one side, my father in his apartment abroad, an older cousin who had been present during the original events, who I had called and who had agreed to be on the call as someone who could confirm what needed confirming. My father had aged since he'd left. Not dramatically, just the specific thing that happens to people who are carrying something without being allowed to put it down. I told him what I'd found, walked him through all of it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I have something to show you. I'm sending it now." The email arrived while we were on the call, a report from a forensic image analyst, detailed, professional. I said, "What is this?" He said, "The photographs." I said, "What photographs?" He said, "You didn't receive photographs." I said, "No." He was quiet for a moment. He said he was going to send photographs of me with a woman I work with, constructed to look like an affair. He must have decided not to, or maybe the plan changed when you found the photograph in the box before he got to that step. He said, "I've had this report for 2 years. A private analyst confirmed the images were constructed from separate sources. I had them because I knew he was planning something and I wanted to be ready when it arrived." I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Because I knew him, and I knew that what we did to him was the kind of thing that produces this kind of response. I've been waiting for it for years." He said it without self-pity, just accurately. The cousin confirmed the basic shape of what my mother had told me: the girlfriend, the secret, the years of coordinated concealment. My father said, "I'm not asking for anything. I left because your mother and I couldn't hold what we'd done in the same house anymore. Not after it finally came up properly between us." He said, "I just want you to know that the photographs, if they arrived, they weren't real." I said they didn't arrive. He said, "Good, then maybe this is where it ends." I hired a PI 6 weeks after the call. 3 weeks of work. She traced the name Marcus had used to a constructed profile created approximately 18 months before our first coffee, long enough to have a digital footprint, not long enough to survive professional scrutiny. She traced travel records as far as public information allowed. He had left the country approximately 4 months before I found the photograph in the box. The trail went cold across 2 countries. Tracking him further would require resources I didn't have, financially or emotionally. I talked to Gene about it. He said, "What would finding him actually give you?" I sat with that. I said, "I don't know." He said, "You know what happened. You know what he did and why he did it. You know what your family did to produce it. Is there something finding him would add to that?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe just confirmation that he's real, that the whole thing was real." Gene said, "The photograph is real. The visitor log absence is real. The disconnected number is real. Your mother's account is real. Your father's report is real." He said, "He's real." I stopped the investigation. My parents are both rebuilding. My father came back to the country last month. He and my mother are not together. That's not what rebuilt means in this situation. But there are phone calls that are not the phone calls of 2 people who have closed a door permanently. I don't know what that means for them long term. I don't think they know either. My mother has been in therapy. She says it helps in the specific way of things that hurt before they help. My father is my father. The version I know, careful, measured, someone who builds things and lives inside them carefully, is more complicated now than it was a year ago. It's also still him. I'm finding out that people being complicated doesn't mean you were wrong about the real parts of them. Gene is still Gene. He came over last week and we watched something bad on television and he fell asleep on my couch, and I let him sleep because some things don't need to be said. 2 weeks ago I found the post. I wasn't looking for it. Someone had linked it in a thread about family betrayal. It was years old. The comments were still active. I read every word, every update. I read 5 years of waiting, finding an Instagram account and sitting and weeping for an hour, a brother coming to the door in the cold, a mother sick and apologetic, a will being rewritten. I read the person my uncle was before he was the man who planned a careful, months-long operation against my family. The person who had loved someone genuinely and had that love taken from him by the people who owed him the most. I read what my family did to him, and I sat with it for a long time. Because here is the thing I've been trying to find language for since I found it. My uncle had a right to his anger. What was done to him was comprehensive and sustained, and required the active participation of everyone who should have protected him. He was 24 years old, and the people he trusted most reorganized themselves around a secret that was his to know, and kept it for years, and let him search for someone who wasn't missing and grieve a relationship that had been deliberately ended without explanation. He was owed something. He was also not the only person who paid. Dina left because of what carrying this did to me across the months I was carrying it. My father left the country with a report in his email that he'd been sitting on for 2 years waiting for something that never quite arrived in the form he expected. My mother has been in therapy learning to hold something she should have put down years ago. None of that was deserved by any of us. I posted a comment on the original thread, carefully, not explaining everything, just indicating that I might have a perspective worth hearing. The comment was buried within hours under responses from people who had read the post and decided where the blame belonged. They weren't wrong about what my family did. They just didn't know who I was or what the response had cost. I deleted the comment after a day. My uncle is somewhere outside this country. The Pies report is as far as I can get without more than I have. I don't know if he thinks about me. The kid in the Instagram photos, the one who looked like his mother apart from the eyes, the one who was born into the middle of a story already in motion, the one who didn't start any of this and who absorbed a significant portion of the cost of responding to it. I don't know if he knows I found the post. I can't be angry at him without acknowledging what my family did. I can't defend my family without acknowledging what they became in the response. My therapist says holding both is the honest position and the hardest one, and that I should give myself time. I'm trying to give myself time. My grandfather used to end every call the same way. Stay curious. I'm trying to do that too.
Hey guys, Talks from the Net here. Thanks for listening till the end. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to bring you more interesting stories. See you next time.